All right, we're live.
Yes.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for bearing with us through the
Yeah,
technical difficulties. We are excited that you've stuck with us and ready to start. This is our 6th installment of our weekly webinar series. My name is Ashley Young, and I am the Prisoner and Family Coordinator for the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. Our mission is to defend civil liberties and freedoms, promote a fair U.S. criminal justice system, and advocate for the rights of political prisoners targeted on the war on terror. You can find our previous webinars on topics ranging from COVID-19 in federal prison, the Holy Land 5, to last week's episode on Black Lives and the death of Mohammed Yusuf in prison on the video section of our Facebook page or on our Civil Freedoms YouTube channel where you can subscribe. Today, I'm joined by 3 special guests who will engage. Today I'm joined by 3 special guests who will engage with both myself and with our audience on a very important issue that deserves more attention, and that's the FBI's criminalization of mental illness. We touched on this topic 2 weeks ago during our episode on CVE programs and how they're used to target Muslims, not violence. Our experts in that episode specifically discussed how dealing with mental vulnerabilities could be singled out and reported to the government for scrutiny, surveillance, and infiltration. With protesters taking to the streets over the past few weeks following the killing of George Floyd, we are seeing people demand not only justice and accountability, but fundamental change in policing and the role of law enforcement. A shift is happening in our nation, and people are talking now more than ever about law enforcement tactics and their targeting of minority communities. A topic that is much less talked about, but deserving of equal scrutiny in these conversations in regards to federal law enforcement, that's the FBI. The FBI has been plagued with scandal since its inception, from the McCarthy era to COINTELPRO in the 60s, and now its post-11 treatment of Muslim Americans. We have seen time and time again that when the FBI cannot find terrorists in America, they manufacture them. Perhaps simply to boost their numbers or satisfy their massive budget. We call this preemptive prosecution. It's a practice the coalition is committed to ending. Preemptive prosecution is the practice of targeting individuals who have never committed a crime, but the FBI believes that they may present a potential for violence and commit a crime in the future. Most of these manufactured cases have gone without scrutiny. One group of people who seems to be incredibly vulnerable to these predatory preemptive practices of the FBI are those suffering from mental illness. And this is what we're here to focus about today. I have met dozens and dozens of family members over the past few years whose loved ones fall into this category, and it's heart-wrenching to hear. They are preyed upon in elaborate sting operations using highly paid informants, acting as agent provocateurs. These informants and their FBI handlers create the plot from A to Z, get an unsuspecting target to fall into their trap, and then the FBI swoops in, foils their own plot, and the nationwide headlines of an arrest labeling the FBI as the hero. Today, I have 2 fathers with us who will share their tragic stories. Showket Ferdaus, whose son Rezwan is the victim of FBI entrapment, arrested in 2011, sentenced to 17 years. And John Cornell, whose son Chris is also a victim of FBI entrapment, arrested in 2015 and sentenced to 30 years in prison. I couldn't imagine having this conversation without them, and I'm so grateful that they could join us today to share their stories. I would like to emphasize that although these cases we are featuring are dated from a few years ago, these prosecutions are still very much happening, and more families are affected by it every year. But first, I would like to introduce to you Trevor Aaronson, an investigative journalist who has done perhaps the most extensive reporting on this subject. Trevor is a contributing writer for The Intercept and a 2020 ASU Future Security Fellow at New America. He is also the executive director of the nonprofit Florida Center for Investigative Reporting and author of The Terror Factory, Inside the FBI's Manufactured War on Terrorism. It's a book I own and I promote it highly. His 2015 TED Talk, how this FBI strategy is actually creating US-based terrorists, has been viewed more than 1 million times and translated into more than 20 languages. He has won numerous awards and honors, including the Mali National Journalism Prize. Please be sure to stick around following the full discussion for a Q&A, and please feel free to type your questions for our guest in the comment section on either Facebook Live or on Zoom. We will address each of them. But now I would like to turn it over to Trevor for an overview of his reporting on the topic.
Hey everyone, thanks Ashley. I really appreciate the introduction. So as Ashley mentioned, my hope and goal in this talk is to really give you an overview of this issue. And I want to preface it by saying that, you know, clearly a lot of people who are mentally ill end up becoming targets of FBI sting operations. And there's a real question of, you know, why this should be happening. And I think that this fact exists in a world where it's also factual to say that the FBI doesn't specifically go out and target mentally ill people. Like, I don't think it's fair to say that FBI agents in offices around the country are going and saying, hey, let's go find mentally ill people and throw them in prison. That's not the reality. But the truth is that the bureaucracy within the FBI and the policies that exist and the tactics that they use end up kind of creating this perfect storm or this perfect recipe that allows for the victimization and the targeting of people who are mentally ill. And so if you'll indulge me for a few minutes, I mean, the history of these programs or the use of sting operations in counterterrorism programs in general really dates back to 9/11, when the FBI was caught fairly flat-footed on its intelligence gathering. And one of the findings of the 9/11 report was just that the FBI's ability to gather intelligence from within Muslim communities was not what they believed it should be. And there was this huge effort in the immediate years after 9/11, where George W. Bush went to Robert Mueller, then the FBI director, and said, never again, there can never be another terrorist attack like 9/11. And so the FBI became simultaneously this organization that investigates crime and investigates the type of crime that it had done before 9/11, whether that's bank fraud or mortgage fraud or bank robbery or organized crime. And it had also become an organization that was taking on roles that were generally associated with intelligence agencies, finding plots and terrorists before they might strike. And so it created this kind of duality within the FBI. And what the FBI did to satisfy the demands at the time was to recruit an unprecedented number of informants. So if you go back in the FBI's history, when we look at J. Edgar Hoover and the COINTELPRO controversies, you know, the FBI at that time had 1,500 informants. And if you fast forward to the 80s, when the FBI received concurrent jurisdiction with the DEA to investigate drugs, they increased that number to 6,000. And that's about where it stayed through the 90s. And then when you get to 9/11, there was this enormous increase, almost this threefold increase to more than 15,000, which is where we are today, more than that number. And what we know from FBI agents is that the vast majority of those informants were then assigned to Muslim communities in order to find people who the FBI believed were on the verge of committing some sort of attack. And you know, the tactic and policy for the FBI was to say, okay, let's go out into Muslim communities and find people who are the most dangerous and the most willing to move forward in an attack. And so the early criticism of these cases, obviously, was that they were finding people who would espouse violence and talk about very extreme beliefs, but that might not have had the capacity or even the idea for attacks. And so the FBI would then provide that, whether it's, you know, providing the idea or allowing the idea to mature and helping with the maturity of that idea, or providing weapons. And in many cases in these early sting operations, the FBI wouldn't just provide like a machete or a gun, they would provide, you know, car bombs and military grade hardware like Stinger missiles that even an organized, you know, sophisticated organized criminal organization would have trouble obtaining. And so these tactics persisted over the years. And then around the late 2000s, we see this movement from the FBI away from finding people in local mosques to finding people online on Facebook and Twitter who are then espousing similarly extreme or unpopular beliefs in the FBI's view, and targeting them with informants. And so when we look at kind of the canon of sting operations, we've had more than 300 defendants since 9/11 caught up in these sting operations in which the FBI, provides everything necessary, provides all of the weapons. And there's an extraordinary number of people among those cases, although it's certainly not all of those cases, but a good number of cases within that 300 where people who are targeted by the FBI are diagnosed later or before with things like schizoaffective disorder, which is a mental disorder that means they have trouble distinguishing between reality and fantasy. And then there's also a large number of cases among that cohort where there wasn't necessarily a diagnosis before or after arrest, but that the behavior of the individual suggested that there was definitely some mental problems happening, right? As an extreme example, there was a case outside of New York, north of New York in Newburgh, and it was a relatively well-known case now called the Newburgh Four, where an undercover FBI informant led 4 black men in a plot to bomb synagogues in the Bronx and later supposedly to fire missiles at airplanes. There are clear questions about 2 of those men, including the kind of supposed leader of the group having mental issues. But just as an extreme example, one of the men who the FBI included in this group at his arrest was living in an apartment where he had collected all of his urine in jars and was putting it on shelves all around his bedroom, right? And so obviously this is a man whose mental faculties and mental health is clearly in question, and yet the FBI would arrest them. And so what seems to be the case in a lot of these FBI sting operations is that they are catching really 2 types of people. The one person is the loudmouth and the person who has perhaps violent ideas, but doesn't have the capacity to commit violence or terrorism or significant acts of violence or terrorism. And then the FBI provides that to them. And then the other part of this, the other kind of group that they end up getting are the people who are mentally ill and are espousing violence for reasons that may be more rooted in their mental illness than any sort of extreme ideology or terrorist-related ideology. An example of that is there was this case in southern Florida involving this homeless man named James Medina, and James Medina had this history of threatening his own family members with death. He was going to kill them for rather petty reasons, and he never followed through. It was just part of this terrible mental illness that he'd had and had been diagnosed with, and had contributed to the fact that he was homeless to that day. He ends up meeting an FBI informant, and the FBI informant encourages violence, which for this guy, James Medina, wasn't a particularly hard sell, but then is the one who is like, hey, we should do this act of violence in the name of ISIS. And, James Medina didn't even really know what ISIS was, but just was like, okay, man, let's go ahead and do that. And ultimately then is charged with, material support in a plot related to ISIS, which was in fact the undercover FBI informant's suggestion at the end. And so what's important to recognize about these sting operations is there has yet to be a case where the FBI is running a sting operation and they find someone who is actually on the verge of an attack, like they've got a garage full of bombs or they have all these weapons. I mean, ironically, among the 300 people that the FBI has caught in these sting operations, none has actually been operational. They've all been people that the FBI made operational through these stings, and of those, a significant portion appear to have mental illness. And what the mental illness seems to allow the FBI to do is to kind of manipulate these people further. In any of these FBI sting operations, there's a certain amount of manipulation that happens. I mean, I think even the people who are caught up in these sting operations who are not mentally ill are generally vulnerable in a number of ways. Either they misunderstand the religion, and an undercover agent is able to tell them things that they say the Quran says that doesn't, or interpretations of the Quran that don't exist. Alternatively, they may be kind of general misfits and looking for someone to look up to in society, and that's a role that the agent plays. So there's really this power dynamic that exists even in cases that don't involve mental illness. But we see that power dynamic play out even greater in cases where the mental illness is, plainly apparent. As an example of this, there was this case actually not far from where I live in Florida, in Tampa, involving this man named Sammy Osmakash, and they wrapped him up in this sting operation. And when they asked Sammy initially, and I should preface this and say Sammy was among those who had schizoaffective disorder. So, he would read and hear about things that were in movies or books, and he would really struggle to separate that from the reality that he was living in. And so when he gets wrapped up in this sting operation, he's asked by the undercover agent, what would you like to do? What kind of plot would you like to get involved in? And Sammy says that he wants to blow up all 5 bridges that cross Tampa Bay, simultaneously, right? And if you've ever read Batman cartoons or comics or saw any of the Batman movies, you realize this is like a plot that's like from the supervillain Bane, right? And so who knows where Sammy got it, but there's a good chance he got it from watching a movie or reading a comic book. And then he recites this to the FBI as if that's something that's actually accomplishable in this reality. And instead of the FBI then saying, look, this guy's crazy, there's no way he can move forward with this, he's clearly mentally ill, they coax him towards something that's more manageable, and that's where they then draw him into a plot that he can actually do. But left to his own devices, this mentally ill man was trying to, accomplish something that would be possible even for SEAL Team 6, and yet he has no capacity to even get involved in a minor act of violence, and yet now is, in prison for, more than 2 decades as a result of this case. And so what's that? The reason that I think, the FBI ends up catching so many mentally ill people without necessarily having a specific goal of catching mentally ill people is that the policy of sting operations really ends up drawing out mentally ill people at an inordinate rate. That is to say that by going online and looking for people who are saying extremist things, or going into mosques and looking for people who are saying very extremist things, they will find extremists doing that. But they're also finding people who have mental conditions that are inspiring them to do this. And when I've really pressed FBI agents on this to say well, look, I've looked at this case and this person clearly, to me, did not seem to be a threat. And he clearly had mental issues. Wouldn't it be better, instead of, spending, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on FBI personnel and time to run this sting operation, wouldn't it be better to get him in front of a psychologist and figure out some other alternative to incarcerating him for the next 2 or 3 decades? And when I pressed FBI agents on this, they'll acknowledge that, yeah, some of these guys have mental issues and they're not always diagnosed, and we're not always very clear whether they are mentally ill or just violent extremists. But ultimately, what they say is that, what do you think the FBI is? The FBI is not some social services agency. We are a hammer looking for the nail, and those guys look a lot like nails. And so as a result, they end up prosecuting them. And, we live in this climate now that I think pretty clearly, and demonstrably we can say that, someone who's charged with, Islamist terrorism today in a post 9/11 environment has a very difficult time at trial. I mean, the data clearly shows that your chances of acquittal at trial is very low. And so the FBI is able to play on that, the Justice Department is able to play on that. And what we have is a situation where people who are mentally ill ultimately are incarcerated and as criminals rather than as people who are mentally ill. And then there's this crazy irony in this, which is in many cases, the people that they are prosecuting who are mentally ill finally get sent to prison. And when they get to prison, they're actually able to get the mental health that they have long needed. And so, in some of these cases I've talked to, for example, Sammy Osmakash, the one who was involved in the Tampa plot, after being incarcerated for a couple of years, I talked to him and he was talking to me about how he feels so much better because he actually got the medication that he needed. And I think obviously this is a problem that pervades the criminal justice system, and the fact that we over-incarcerate by an inordinate degree in the United States, but that we're locking up many mentally ill people. But I think, what we're seeing in these terrorism sting operations is kind of a piece of that larger problem, that mentally ill people are getting locked up for a variety of crimes. And that includes things like terrorism, because the FBI is wrapping mentally ill people up in these types of sting operations. And I guess I'll end this to say that, in my view, this really isn't just about mentally ill people, because obviously that is a big part of this, and the personal tragedy of, the parents that you'll hear from today can attest to that. But I would say that the other effect of this is that it has this larger effect on our society in general and Muslim communities in particular, because what ends up happening when you charge and convict someone who is mentally ill in an FBI, in a high-profile FBI case in which they allege they were involved in terrorism, that it really inflates the general perception among Americans of terrorism from within Muslim communities. It's one more case of a supposed Muslim that they hear was involved in an act of terrorism. And so not only are we then perhaps unfairly locking up a lot of these people who are mentally ill, we're then contributing to the perception of this very exaggerated threat from within Muslim communities. And that in turn is something that fuels, further public policy and further funding for the FBI, which in turn just fuels more and more of these cases where it becomes a wag the dog kind of situation. So anyway, I hope this is helpful. I'm here to answer questions, and I really appreciate the time to be here.
Thank you so much, Trevor. That was definitely very helpful. One thing I'd like to add is that Sammy Osmikoff was actually sentenced to 40 years in prison, just a slight edit. One thing that I would like to know is how you got interested in reporting on this issue that really is very underreported.
So this was a fairly long road. My interest in these cases started in 2006 when I was living and working in Miami, and one of the early sting cases was this case called the Liberty City 7. Liberty City is a poor area of Miami, and I initially followed the arrest, and I remember thinking that the case was just absurd because if you were the Al-Qaeda terrorist network and you were looking to hide people in Miami, like Liberty City would have been the last place you would have chosen. So the idea that they would have that this was real was incredible to me. But even more incredible was the way that most of the media at the time, took the government's narrative and kind of ran with it without much questioning. And so then as the years went by, I began to see more and more of these cases, and there continued to be this, and this is true of almost all crime stories. Whenever a crime happens, the government or the police agencies or the prosecutors have the first say in what the narrative is, because it takes a few days before, the people who are charged or their family members are able to kind of put together a counter narrative. And that's particularly true in these terrorism cases. And so, what I began to see is these cases that were clearly very questionable, whether the people who had gotten involved in these cases would have been able to commit the crimes they were alleged to have committed were it not for the FBI. And so, starting in 2010, I started to kind of assemble a database of these cases that ultimately became the root kind of research work for what later became my book. And, honestly, this was not something that I expected to spend a decade writing about in general. But, the truth is that these cases have just continued and in some ways changed. And I just think it's a really important criminal justice story in general. And one thing I'd like to emphasize is that, it's not just about Muslims and it's not just about terrorism. I mean, these kinds of abusive tactics that government use, what we often see is that it's applied first to communities that are seen as most vulnerable, and then it's applied later. And so what we've seen, just in the last few years is an adaptation of these tactics to white collar crimes such as money laundering, where they're, for example, finding people who, don't have any capacity to launder money, but then going to them and being like, hey man, how would you like to make $100,000 and I can make it happen for you? And they're finding people who are willing to do that and then prosecuting them as hardcore money launderers. And, while it's difficult to defend money launderers as it is difficult to defend terrorists, it's worth noting that these tactics that they've adapted and won prosecutions for going against Muslims or people who identify as Muslims but maybe new to the religion in terrorism cases are tactics that are being applied elsewhere. And so this isn't just a case about Muslims and terrorism. This is really, a story about Muslims and terrorism. This is really a story about how the FBI and the Justice Department are applying, justice in a number of different cases.
I love that you point that out. It is something that the coalition talks about quite frequently. At the end of this discussion, I'm going to speak about a legislative fix that we are trying to get introduced to kind of close the loophole on these tactics that are used. But one thing we always say is that the next political prosecution that you might be preventing could be your own, because it does start in one community and moves to others. So thank you so much, Trevor. I'd like to go over to our family members now. So the Coalition for Civil Freedoms, every year we have what's called a family conference, and all of us who have loved ones who have been affected, loved ones who are in prison, get together every year. We learn effective advocacy, we learn how to lobby our lawmakers, we also focus on storytelling, we take time to try to learn how to heal, and then we also connect with each other. And one thing that we get to hear at this family conference is we get to meet each other and we're able to humanize each other. These cases, these people who are involved in these cases are not just causes. They're not just cases. They're not just prison sentences. They're humans with hopes, needs, desires, and plans for the future. And so one thing I would like to start before I speak with these family members, speak with them about their loved ones' cases, one thing I'd like to start with is asking them, can you tell me about your loved one? So Showket, I'll start with you, and then John, I'll come to you. Showket, if you could just tell me and tell us who Rezwan, your son, is. And then we'll get into his case a little bit after that. It looks like we're having problems with Showket unmuting. So John, why don't we start with you? If you could please tell us about Chris. I speak to him, so I know him, but please share your son with us.
Can you hear me now, Ashley? Okay. Yeah. Wow. Christopher has a heart of gold. You know, I mean, he was never really a problem child, but we knew he had behavior problems at a very young age. And we took him to counseling, and we did everything we thought we needed to do. And but anyway, I mean, Chris he's such a wonderful person. I mean, his mother would take him to the store, and he would see a homeless person. He would see a homeless person on the street corner, and they were going to get ice cream. And he said, "Mom, can I have my ice cream money?" She said, "Yeah, sure, why?" He got it out of the car, and he gave it to the homeless guy. And his mom asked him, why did you do that? And he said he needed it more than me. He used to get on his bike and fill his backpack with bottles of water and ride around to homeless people. He was just lost, and I think he was just searching for a way. And I believe he felt like him and his generation just don't have a chance in this environment today. He was such a loving, kind, wonderful person. And this is not Chris. I mean, they painted him to look like a monster, but he's not the monster they painted. And they did entrap Christopher.
Thank you so much, John. I definitely have experienced that from speaking with Chris. Number one, he has a really good sense of humor. And yes. Number two, he is always concerned about other people. Even when he's going through a lot, when I speak to him, he's always asking me about others, asking me about myself. So I definitely feel that from him. So now I'd like to turn it over to Showket again and ask if he could tell us a little bit about his son as well. Thank you, John.
Oh, boy.
Showket,
can you hear me?
I can hear you now. I can hear you now.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. Okay, so my son Rezwan Ferdaus, who was, first of all, he was a great musician. He was very known for his musical skill. In his high school senior year, he was voted the most musical in the whole of high school. And he was a brilliant student. He went to Northeastern University as a Bunch Scholar. Northeastern University in Boston, they give every year 30 students out of 3,000 freshmen. The 100% room, board, tuition, everything is free for 4 years. And Rezwan was one of them. And he received that just based on his essay that he wrote. And so he, as far as his whole high school life was concerned, I never have to worry about him because he was never got into any trouble. He was a soccer player. He played for the varsity soccer along with his brother. And but at the end, at the last semester of his Northeastern University, and that was January of 2008, I started noticing in him, suddenly he became very quiet. He gave up his playing bands and drums and started to tell me he was living in the dorm as paid for by the school. And he said he wants to come back home. And we live about 22 miles in the west of Northeastern University. And so he came home and he started commuting using his car to Boston. Then I noticed that he's no longer playing bands and he's very becoming introvert, and he's not even trying to enjoy his time with his own brother and myself and all this. So, but he did finish his graduation in time with a BS degree in physics. Then after that, it was a very, the Great Recession of 2008 came, and it was not easy to get a job, even though as a freshman, his first co-op job with Northeastern University, then he was the MIT Lincoln Lab in biodefense lab. Then he worked in big medical company just as a sophomore, and those are his co-op jobs. But after his graduation, because Great Recession was difficult, but eventually he did find a job at the end of about February 2009 with a medical company and as a quality assurance engineer. But after about a few months, the whole quality assurance department got laid off. And this is the same company, his name is Emily Doles. It's a few years later, the whole company was dissolved and everybody was, including the CEO, and everybody was put into trial because they are accused of killing 67 people worldwide by doing the wrong medications. And this is what Rezwan and his group talked about in 2009, May of 2009, and they got laid off because of that, fired because of that. And Rezwan got very, very disappointed with that, and I can see that he's mentally is getting even worse and worse. And then in end of 2009, he developed serious obsessive compulsive disorder. And this disorder so bad that he was no longer able to control his bladder. And there are some certain things that happened that FBI knew all of these things. They came to our house in 2010, October 21 of 2010, and then I came from work and the whole house was empty. I just entered the house and they came in, they asked me, pointing to his car, whose car it was. I said, this is my son's car, but it is in my name. And then they said, well, this car, somebody reported that somebody went to a gun shop and this car was, then later they went to this car and left the place, but that was nothing illegal. So they wanted to talk to Rezwan. They came inside. I called Rezwan, they came in, and they kept telling him that, who's that guy with a scar in the face? Rezwan was so bad those days because he keeps saying, oh, these are all racist, these are all racist. Then after a while, they couldn't get anything out of him. While they were going, they told me, obviously, he has mental issues. So they knew about his mental issues. And then it came out in the, when the bail hearing in the court of, I think, November, something like November 4th or something like that of 2011. September, something like that, I forgot the date, that they admitted when his lawyer was interrogating the FBI lead agent, he admitted that they know about this and they have found Rezwan once in our next town in the middle of the night. He's standing in the middle of the street and he has wet himself thoroughly. I don't know which way to go, but and they knew about this. So the lawyer asked them, wasn't it a concern for you? They said, well, it was a consideration, but not a concern. And because they said, oh, mentally sick people can also do terrorist things. Okay. So Rezwan was nothing. He had that those days he has no job, nothing. He has no mental capability, nothing to do anything. He's staying at home basically. And he used to go to Worcester Mosque with me, and this is where they brought in a guy. He was not even a Muslim, but he was always in the mosque, and he's the guy who started recording him. And that was the first recording they did on January 7, 2011. And that day I was in the mosque on Friday because I was keeping always eye on Rezwan because he has become very skinny and so I should keep an eye on him. And so after the Jummah prayer from the other side of the mosque, somebody called his name, Rezwan. And when I looked at that person, immediately it struck me. This is a bulky, short guy with a big scar in his face. And then I immediately said, maybe this is what FBI was talking about. This is the guy FBI was talking about. Then he came to Rezwan, then Rezwan introduced him to me. And I said, let's go downstairs, where I bought the lunch for Rezwan, which I used to do every Friday. And then I bought the lunch for him also. Then I asked him, where are you from? He said, I am from Egypt. I said, Egypt, where is your parents? I said, oh, they're in Connecticut right now. So I said, what is your name? And he said, my name is Khalil. And then later, when Rezwan got arrested, I found out that was the day he was already wired. And as soon as I left the mosque, he recorded some of the stuff about Rezwan right in front of the mosque. And Rezwan was in a state that you could ask him anything, and he will tell you whatever you want to know. And so this was the kind of thing that they take all the time advantage. And I have gone through Rezwan, so many other things has happened to him since he was arrested in 2011. And right now he's in California. So he's my wife who passed away last September. And actually all these things started after Rezwan's arrest. She got a stroke, then after a stroke, she had the cancer, so she passed away now. So, it's very, very sad. There are so many things I have recorded. I have a website that I maintain for Rezwan, and every time that I do visit Rezwan, I recorded everything what went on, all kinds of things. He was tortured. I don't know if I should say it or not, but why not? He was tortured in just 2018 in USP Lee. He was tortured then, and the NCPCF got involved, and they were able to take him out of the air to California within a month. And so as far as Rezwan was concerned, he was a great student. He was a great person who never gave us any hard time. But he was very busy playing music and drums all the time. Nobody said anything. But the moment he became sick, the moment he became little religious, and he became a target.
Showket, thank you so much, so much for sharing this story. One day I hope to see Rezwan play drums in person.
Well, I have all his stuff still in my basement, and like he taught himself how to play piano. He didn't have to go to school. How to play guitar. He combined the Indian music, tabla and everything with all of these together. He used to play all of these things same time.
That's awesome. That's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think, again, thank you so much for sharing all of that. I find it incredibly despicable the way you described that the FBI knew and that he was having severe mental problems and that they didn't consider it. They said it didn't matter. And I think that we see.
If I may say something.
Sure.
You see, this is in FBI's training manual, right? That any Muslim who is religious is a potential terrorist. This is in their training manual. And according to their training manual, my mother, who's a religious Muslim, was a terrorist too.
Yeah. Yep.
So this is also another systematic issue.
Yes, thank you. Definitely, absolutely. It is one of the problems that have gone completely unaddressed, according to, like you said, you know, the FBI playbook. If you grow a beard, you're becoming extremist. If you cut your beard, you're becoming extremist. It's literally, it's used, it can be used so broad. But so I want to turn it over to John now, and I want to hear a little bit more about your son's case, and how things played out with him. I also want to real quick preface this conversation by saying that both of these families, their loved ones had to take plea deals. And that is by no way an admittance of guilt. And we see time and time and time again that the majority of people who are up against the system end up taking plea deals out of fear of what's called a trial tax. A trial tax is if the FBI says, hey, you're facing 60 years in prison, that's life in prison, but we'll give you 10 years if you take a plea deal. Everyone who's staring down the barrel of that gun, most of the people are going to go ahead and take the plea deal because they're up against a wall. So I just wanted to make that distinction real quick. But now, John, I want to turn it over to you and hear a little bit more about Chris's case and how it played out, if you could.
Okay. Yeah, Christopher actually took his plea deal while on death row because of trouble that he had gotten into, right? He got in trouble in the county jail for hacking into the computer system and exposing the informant. He found them the same way we did, and he exposed them all over the world, I guess. And they put him on death row for a year. His lawyers were going up there every week. You know, you got to take this plea bargain. You got to take this plea bargain. They're going to charge your parents. So he was under a lot of duress, already suffering from mental illness. I mean, he was diagnosed as a little boy, with oppositional defiance disorder. Everything came out in court, about his different mental illnesses. But anyway, getting back to the entrapment, Christopher has never even fired a real gun. I mean, this plan they had was so crazy. And I mean, it sounds terrible, and if you listen to it, I mean, it was impossible. Like Trevor, it was an impossibility. They were going to plant bombs around the Capitol and shoot government employees after they set them off and ran out. That was the plan. But anyway, getting back to the entrapment, Christopher never even had the money to buy those guns. He put up $500, and I think they put up the rest in marked money. They sent him into the gun store to buy the guns, after he tried to back out too, let me just say that he tried to back out of this whole thing on three occasions. The informant said, no, I just drove 1,300 miles. We're going through with it. He took Christopher to the gun shop, sent him in to buy the guns, gave him the money, sent him in to buy the guns. And the gun store clerk actually couldn't sell him the guns because his background check came back declined. It came back declined because it was an open investigation. And I guess the FBI wasn't ready for that, right? So the gun store clerk didn't know what to do. He sent Christopher out of the store to get a phone number, or he wanted the phone number from Christopher. Christopher didn't want to give our number because he was afraid, they would call our house and we would know something was wrong. So the informant got him a Google phone number, and within 5 minutes, he went back into the gun shop, and the gun shop owner said, I got good news. I can sell you the guns now. So yeah, he had actually been declined the gun sale. And so they sell him the guns, and as soon as he hits the parking lot, they take him down and charge him with attempted murder. I know the law, what the law reads, and for buying a firearm to commit a crime, but he never brandished a firearm. He never attempted to kill anyone. And something that has to be done about these laws. I mean, it's, and I know that he was targeted because he was a Muslim. He had been posting some radical stuff on the internet. I mean, but if he had crossed the line, why didn't they get him then? It was all free speech, and then this FBI informant gets involved and dragged him into this whole plot, and which I don't condone what Christopher said and did. It's not like he was completely innocent, but they took advantage of his mental illness. I mean, completely. I mean, even at his competency hearing, the psychologist, he was diagnosed with ODD, depression, schizotypal, where he has this imaginary thinking. I think Trevor might have touched on that. Just numerous things. And like I said, he took this plea bargain under duress. I mean, their first he was facing life. Their first offer was 60 years. They came back with 40, and he took a plea bargain under duress for 30 years. And we find out later he couldn't even appeal his sentence because he had waived his right to appeal. And the appeals, his attorneys had to know this. They were the one that wrote up, that dealt with the plea bargain. And they told me that they wanted a fresh set of eyes to take at it. And they let the court appoint a new attorney. And he was unaware that Christopher had waived his rights. And it came back denied because he had waived his rights. And he told us that we needed to file a motion for ineffective counsel and prosecutorial misconduct because they illegally sentenced Chris. And we have never been able to find an attorney within 1,000 miles of where we live because most of the attorneys around here, they used to fight entrapment. But now I guess that the FBI and the Justice Department's made entrapment legal. I mean, it's become common practice, and it's terrible. I mean, they're taking advantage of these poor kids. Christopher is a 20-year-old kid, sheltered most of his life, had never been in the streets. I brought him up because I wanted him to have better than what I had. And they took his whole life, 30 years. What does he have to look forward to? He don't get out till 2041. I'll be long gone. He won't have anyone. But that's what they're doing. They don't care who they hurt in the process. They don't care. As long as they make themselves look good. That's what it's about. Like Trevor said, it makes them look good. Oh boy, look what we did. We thwarted this big terrorist attack. Yeah. It kills me because the guy that the informant in Christopher's case was an actual convicted terrorist. And it became snitch. That's what I call them. I don't call them informants. I call them snitches. And I wish they dealt with snitches the way they did in the old days. But anyway, I don't know, Ashley. I mean, like I said, he's never even fired a gun before. I took his BB gun away because his brother was shooting birds. God.
John is perfect at what you said. Thank you so much. You guys, for everyone listening, I want everyone to know how hard it is for these family members to discuss the trauma, the ongoing trauma, the legal battles, the absolute nightmare, the fact that their loved ones have been preyed upon. So I just want to thank you guys both for speaking to us. One thing, John, that I remember when we spoke is you said the informant had such influence over Chris, but he would have followed him anywhere. You know, he would have
Exactly.
he would have done anything. And I think it just goes to show, you know, I remember you saying that they were laughing about him at one point, the FBI was, the handlers. It just goes to show that it is really a predatory practice.
Even the doctor said actually, if they had tried to take Chris down the other path, the good path, the righteous path, that he would have followed.
I agree.
But no, that's not how it works. You know, that's not, like Trevor said, that's not their job to babysit or to be counselors or whatever. That's not their job. And then the guy doesn't get paid the $100,000 they gave him for snitching.
Right. Thank you so much, John. You guys, it brings up further conversations about the role of policing, whether it's local law enforcement or federal law enforcement, the FBI, which is why I'm so happy we're having this discussion. One thing I'd like to mention also is that both of these boys, both Rezwan, I call them boys because they were so young when they were arrested. Rezwan and Chris were both tortured while in prison. Chris was tortured pre-trial before he had been found guilty of anything. They put him on death row before he was found guilty of anything. Rezwan was tortured at the hands of the warden and has scars from that incident. So I just, you know, the ongoing trauma, it doesn't end. It's literally a nightmare every day. But so I do want to talk about the legislative fix that the Coalition for Civil Freedoms has been working on for the past year and a half and will continue to work on. It's called the EGO bill. It's the EGO Relief Act. EGO stands for Entrapment and Governmental Overreach Act. It was designed basically as a legislative fix to these problems, is to close the loopholes on the mechanisms that the FBI is using to really work outside the means of the constitutional boundaries. So it's designed to eliminate three specific problems. The first one is under preemptive prosecution, the FBI relies heavily on entrapment with sting operations, often triggered by the target's exercise of free speech. The EGO bill will codify for the first time an entrapment defense, which would prohibit a conviction by the FBI inducement and manipulation unless the target was already taking substantial steps towards committing the offense before the informant started interacting with them. The second part of the EGO bill is the material support for terrorism law. This is what all of our loved ones are charged under, material support for terrorism. Right, as it stands right now, the law is so broad. Material support could be categorized from, in my brother's case, sending a gift card to an informant. In the Holy Land 5 case, making charitable donations with their charity organization. In another case of Syed Hashmi, the material support was a bag of rain ponchos that was stored at his apartment. So the category of material support is so broad, it is easy to charge anyone under it. And we are asking to close that loophole by requiring that anyone charged under material support has violent intent for a conviction. Meaning that someone who someone who has well intentions cannot be charged with material support. Again, it would require that there's violent intent for someone to be charged for material support. And the third part of the EGO bill is that many preemptive prosecution cases include classified evidence, and it is kept secret under the Classified Information Procedures Act. That means that the prosecution can show secret evidence to the judge, but not show it to the defense, which means the prosecution can be prejudicing the judge against the defendant, and the defense counsel has no way to fight the evidence that they're presenting to the judge. We are saying that this is an infringement of the Sixth Amendment right to confront evidence, and that all evidence shown to the judge should also be shown to security cleared counsel. Again, the EGLE bill has not found a sponsor yet. It has not been introduced yet, but we are asking people of organizations to help us fight for this legislative fix. So now I want to turn it over to the Q&A section. So if anyone has questions, please submit them right now. Let's see. I see one question that says, I've been researching how this narrative is created and sustained. One part is a lack of an actual discussion of how this impacts Muslim communities of color. How can we leverage to bring this conversation to center stage? Immigrant communities of color are already so vulnerable. So that definitely is a problem that communities aren't talking about this issue. They're not talking about how people in their own community are being entrapped. These conversations, frankly, need to happen and start in the Muslim community. If you are part of a community or part of a local organization, contact us. The coalition will come out. We will come out with our experts. We will come out with family members, and we will speak to your community. I will say this till I'm blue in the face, that we need the conversation to start within the Muslim community, and you can't ask people to care about you if you don't care about yourself. And really, it takes courageous people to want to go against the grain and have these difficult conversations. But I definitely, like I said, anyone who's wanting to bring this to your community, please involve the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. We would be more than happy to bring our family members out and discuss these issues in depth. Hold on one second. We have another question. Yeah. Trevor, go ahead and answer that question in the Q&A window.
Sure, yeah. So the question was, Trevor made it sound like having extremist views warrants FBI investigation by itself. Aren't views, no matter how extreme, without acting upon them, considered protected free speech? Yeah, so if I did, in my discussion, if I did suggest the way I said it, that I believe that the FBI was justified based on free speech, I apologize. I'm sure I was trying to articulate what the FBI's view would be. That is certainly not my view. I don't think free speech should be a justification for investigation, and certainly the law is on my side. That said, though, I mean, I think one of the things that's important to realize is that even though the law requires the FBI to have probable cause, just like it would require your local police to have probable cause if they were to stop you at a traffic light, the FBI is in many ways using free speech to investigate people without otherwise having probable cause. And they're able to do that in a couple of different ways. The most obvious way is the use of what are called threat assessments. One of the powers that the FBI was given after 9/11 are so-called threat assessments. And so for a 72-hour period, the FBI is able to investigate people based on any kind of information, including anonymous tip like, hey, I think my neighbor's got a bomb. No matter how much it may lack credibility, the FBI has the authority to investigate that without probable cause. The 72-hour period isn't even really something that the law requires. It's actually FBI policy. And so what we're seeing is that the FBI is using threat assessments very liberally against Muslims, whereas they're not for other groups of people. And then there's also a question of the FBI not being held accountable for the fact that it indeed has used First Amendment protected activities, including things such as how often a person goes to pray in a mosque, for example, as the basis for investigations. Well, technically that is not allowed for under the law. There have been case after case where we can document it happening, and as a result of a lack of accountability in Congress, where these congressional committees aren't holding the FBI accountable in the way that they likely should, we really aren't getting a solid answer or level of accountability on these issues from the FBI. As just one example, there's a lawsuit out of Southern California that has languished for almost a decade now, involving an FBI informant who went public named Craig Monte, who said that he had spied on dozens of people in Southern California's Muslim communities based on nothing more than the fact that they attended a particular mosque. And the FBI has really thrown up roadblock after roadblock in trying to deal with that case and not answer the questions it raises. Among other things, under the Obama administration, Eric Holder, the Attorney General, had declared national security privilege in dealing with that case, which allows the government a far amount of levity in kind of denying answers on things. The case is still moving forward, but we still don't have answers. So I think the kind of larger issue is that, yes, it is illegal for the FBI to start investigations without probable cause, technically, but there's example after example where we see it actually not working that way at all. And in fact, the FBI is using First Amendment protected activity, such as religious activity, for the
Trevor meant about the problem of the Joint Terrorism Task Force in the context of the recent push to defund police. Historically, the FBI has been a tool of political repression, and I think that we need to talk about law enforcement corruption on both the local and the federal level. So, Trevor, could you give us some context there?
Yeah, so the Joint Terrorism Task Forces, or JTTFs as they're known, have existed pre 9/11, but we saw a large growth in them outside of 9/11. And I think this is a really delicate subject and a difficult one. I mean, I think you can make the argument that, if we're looking, one of the things that came out of the 9/11 report was a criticism that agencies weren't exchanging information, that we had the intelligence, we just weren't looking at it in a correct way, and that if agencies such as the CIA and the FBI and local law enforcement had been able to communicate much better, then we could have identified real threats to the country sooner than we really did. And so the idea, if you're kind of on the government side, the idea would be to say that things like the JTTF are meant to facilitate the exchange of information in a way that might help keep us safer. And so, you can make the argument that this could be a beneficial thing in general. In reality, among the problems with the JTTF is that the FBI really has the upper hand, in the sense that local governments are often forced to sign agreements for the JTTF and then not keep copies of those agreements. So, for example, I live in Florida, where there's a very strong records law. And so any contract that's, say, a sheriff's office or police agencies really don't know what their police agencies are doing for the FBI, because the FBI forces these local governments to not keep a copy of those contracts because they don't want jerks like me figuring out what they're doing, right? So there isn't a level of accountability and transparency that there really should be. And I think, organized crimes and counterterrorism, I don't necessarily think looking for things like terrorists. I don't think my local police department should be searching for terrorists, right? Because the idea that there's going to be a terrorist in my backyard is highly unlikely. Instead, it's more likely that I'm going to face property crime, or there's going to be other issues such as traffic accidents that my police agency should be dealing with. And so I think, again, this is another example of post 9/11, we've had an inordinate amount of resources pressed into the counterterrorism field, but actually a very small threat of terrorism in general. And so, if you can make an argument for the JTTF, but I think, the criticism of it would be that it really lacks the accountability and transparency on the local level, the people, who are running these, who are paying taxes, or who are on the county commission or city governments. And then the other question, I think, just from a resource perspective, is I think you could argue pretty substantially that we already devote enough resources to counterterrorism as it is. It's the largest part of the FBI's budget. Do we really need to devote, substantial portions of local police departments to this kind of larger federal effort as well?
Thanks, Trevor. We got one more for you. What are your thoughts on why the amount of cases trended downwards in recent years? Have they shifted focus to other groups in recent years? And I'm curious to know if there is a downward trend, because I wasn't aware of that. Thank you.
So I'd have to look at the data for the last year. There had been a slightly downward trend from 2019 and previous years. And it's hard to, but we also had downward trends in other years. There have been a couple of anomalous years as well. I think, for example, like 2008 had like a relatively low number of cases compared to 7 and 9. And, you know, we don't really have a clear answer for why that would be. But, you know, I would say that there are a number of factors I think that are contributing if we're seeing a decrease. So one in general is that, and this is something that the FBI would say. I'm pretty sure if I asked them this exact question, this would be their answer, which is to say that, you know, as a result of the degradation of groups like ISIS, their ability to distribute propaganda is lower than it was in previous years. And so as a result, we're seeing less inspirational activity just because the output of their propaganda is lower. And that may indeed be, you know, something that is an effect. I mean, you know, one of the things that we tend to see is that when news organizations like cable news pay more attention to ISIS, it tends to generate, you know, more ISIS cases around the same time. Whether that people are getting, you know, inspired because they're watching CNN or because the FBI is pressing down on more on those cases because of media attention, you know, who really knows? But it's a kind of chicken or egg question. And then the other issue is that there has been a tremendous amount of pressure on federal law enforcement as a result of the spate of right-wing terrorist attacks, such as the Walmart shooting in El Paso, where, you know, federal government has put a lot more pressure on the FBI to pursue right-wing groups. And so you know, the FBI doesn't share these numbers. It's reasonable to conclude that we are seeing a bit of a shift in resources away from what the FBI considers international terrorism, such as Islamist extremism, and more toward right-wing groups. You know, but it's hard to know exactly, you know, why that's happening. You know, I think, you know, I would caution in saying that, you know, because we've seen these downward trends in previous years, it doesn't necessarily mean that a 1 or 2 year decline slightly in cases is going to be a trend that holds. It wouldn't surprise me if we begin to see that uptick. But I do think there's something happening. I just don't know that it's enough to really warrant a kind of substantial trend at this point.
Thank you so much, Trevor. You guys, that looks like that's all of our questions. What I'd like to do is give the last words to our fathers who are joining us. So, Showket, we can start with you. Is there any last words or thoughts you would like to share with the people watching?
Yes. Okay. So, yes, there are a couple of things that I have observed is that whenever they find out a young man or whatever, they become mentally ill, my feeling is that FBI actually elaborately plans a frame-up operation. You know, like in Rezwan's case, you know, a year before his arrest, they came to our house and asked me whose car was pointing to his car was there. And they said, somebody went to a gun shop, and later the owner of the gun shop said he went to this car, but it was not Rezwan. But then they described a person with a big scar in his face. So to me, the whole thing was actually fake. They came to ask Rezwan to judge his mental condition, to see if they can make him a target. And after talking to Rezwan, they found out that yes, they can make him a target because Rezwan is not recognizing anything. And this is how I want the future, you know, victims and their families to be aware of. You know, this is not just they come based on some fact. They make up things. Because I asked Rezwan, and he told me also there was nobody who went to a gun shop. When I asked Rezwan, how did you meet this guy, this collaborating witness, who is a gangster, heroin addict, who was charged for a rape, and who was given sentence from armed robbery for 8 years. Then his 8-year sentence was reduced to 3 years to work with FBI. And he came to our house, he tried to beat up my son, older son, other son, and so many other incidents. So they hired people who has no other way, no choice but to get somebody what FBI want, because this is what gives them freedom. So I just wish that the parents keep an eye on their children, young men, that they recognize if they are not feeling mentally well, and please guard them and make sure that they are not under influence of anybody else that are going to take over. FBI literally takes over your mind. That's what they did with Rezwan. They have all these experts, they have all these PhDs, they have billions of dollars with the, 16 or 17 billion dollars to frame you. It's just simple. It's like if somebody gives me this kind of resources, I can probably frame an FBI agent for anything. I am not saying it from out of, this is just simple thing that people can do. Given that so much money and resources, they have to prove that they are doing something. They have to prove that the budget they are getting is worth it. They have to prove it to the Congress people and all of these things. And so I just wish that people keep an eye on their children, especially those who are growing up, and everything is fine as long as they are not doing their religion. As soon as they start doing their religion, most other countries, if a white young man start doing religion, then he will be appreciated. But for a Muslim young guy, he start doing religion, he becomes a potential target. So please be careful for that.
Thank you so much, Showket. And John, we'll turn it over to you for last words.
I just wanted to thank Trevor and the other panelists and everyone for listening and being here. I just want everyone to know that Christopher is not a bad person. Like I said, he has a heart of gold. He didn't even own a car. He didn't even own a car. So they made it sound like, he was packed and ready to go. And he did a lot of stuff to make himself look bad. That's for sure. But he's not a bad person, and I'll always love him. I always support him. I love the coalition. I don't even remember if Christopher was the one that put me onto the coalition or if I just found it searching. But I'm looking forward to our next family conference. And I don't know. I just hope that we get something done. I don't know if I'll see it in my lifetime, but you guys keep up the good fight. You hear me? Keep up the good fight. Because I'm not doing so well. So I'll tell you I'm doing good, but I'm not. I have a lot of health issues, and I'm 66 years old. And some days, my head is just somewhere else, never in a good place. And pray for me, please. I pray for all of you guys every day. Pray for me. And pray for Christopher. This is about him, not me. I'm so sorry I get emotional. I can't help myself.
Okay.
I just can't help it. That is the apple of my eye. They took my son.
Thank you, John. I feel your pain. I want everyone to know, in addition to what I had said about the Muslim community starting these kinds of conversations from within, I also want to real quickly add that there are literally hundreds of us, hundreds of family members who have been affected by the entrapment and the overreach, the overzealous and out of control FBI. And I want to ask people that when these kinds of cases pop up in your community, do not abandon these people. We are fighting this fight pretty much alone, and it is terrifying. Do not abandon these people in their time of need. Someone saying in solidarity with you, John, I feel your pain. I think we all feel your pain. stand up for those who are facing injustice, and definitely help support those in your community who have been targeted in manufactured crimes. Real quickly, I want to end with a know your rights very quickly. Just a reminder that the FBI can lie to you, but you cannot lie to them. If you get a knock at your door or approached by an agent of the FBI, you very politely ask for their card and tell them that your lawyer will contact them. And then you take that card and you call the Coalition for Civil Freedoms. We can help. Do not speak to the FBI without an attorney present. Thank you everyone for joining us today. Trevor, John, Showket, thank you so much. What I'm gonna do is also add the addresses of Chris and Rezwan, and you can go ahead and send them something in the mail, write them a letter, and just, you know, lift their spirits a little bit. So I'll add that in the comment section of the Facebook, their addresses. And everyone take care, and Black Lives Matter, and peace.